Homeowners associations. They're supposed to keep neighborhoods organized, but sometimes they turn into power-hungry tyrants. Tom and Linda had lived in their home for over 15 years. They weren't just homeowners, they were pillars of the community. The kind of neighbors who helped shovel driveways in the winter and hosted backyard barbecues in the summer. But if there was one thing that made their home truly special, it was Linda's beloved rose garden. It wasn't just a few flowers here and there. No, this was a masterpiece. Linda had spent over a decade carefully cultivating hundreds of roses, covering their front yard in vibrant reds, deep purples, soft pinks, and sunny yellows. People from the neighborhood would slow down their cars just to admire the garden. Neighbors on walks would pause to take in the scent of fresh blooms. Some even took pictures, calling it the most beautiful yard in the entire neighborhood. It was Linda's pride and joy, and Tom? He loved seeing how happy it made her. But then, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. Tom checked the mail as usual. Bills, junk mail, a few coupons. But then something else. A thick, white envelope stamped with the official HOA logo. He ripped it open and started reading. Then his blood boiled. The letter was titled Landscaping Violation in big, bold letters. It claimed that their front yard was out of compliance with HOA regulations and that they had 2 weeks to remove the rose garden or else. Tom clenched his jaw and kept reading. It stated, all front yards must maintain a consistent aesthetic with the community standard. Grass must be the dominant feature. Your garden is in violation. At the bottom, in bright red ink, it read, failure to comply will result in fines of $50 per week, increasing until the issue is resolved. Tom couldn't believe it. They had lived there for 15 years. Linda had spent thousands of hours tending to that garden. And now the HOA wanted them to rip it out? He stormed into the house, letter in hand. Linda, he said, his voice shaking, you're not going to believe this. She looked up from the kitchen table, where she had been clipping gardening coupons from a magazine. What's wrong? Tom tossed the letter onto the table. The HOA says your rose garden has to go. Linda's face fell. What? She snatched up the letter and read through it quickly. When she reached the end, she sighed heavily. I don't understand. Why now? It's been here for years. Tom shook his head. I don't know, but I'm not letting this happen. Linda looked at him, her eyes filled with both worry and determination. Neither am I. The next day, Tom dug through their HOA bylaws. Page after page of rules, restrictions, and legal jargon. And that's when he noticed something. The letter claimed that all front yards must have grass as the dominant feature, but it never actually defined what dominant meant. Was 51% grass enough? 60%? Nobody knew. More importantly, Tom had seen other homes in the neighborhood with large flower beds. Some even had decorative gravel instead of grass. So why was the HOA only coming after them? Something wasn't right. Tom decided to fight back. At the next HOA meeting, he walked in, letter in hand. Linda was by his side, her lips pressed into a firm line. The room was filled with homeowners, sitting in plastic chairs, waiting for their turn to voice their concerns. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, and in the middle of them was Karen. Now, Karen wasn't just any HOA president. She was the kind of person who thrived on power. She loved enforcing rules, no matter how ridiculous. Tom took a deep breath and walked up to the microphone. My name is Tom, and I have a question, he said. Karen raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. Tom held up the letter. I received this notice, saying my wife's rose garden is a violation. Can you show me exactly where it says we can't have roses? Karen smirked, adjusting her glasses. The rules state that grass must be the dominant feature in all front yards. Tom nodded. But what does dominant mean? 51% grass? 60%? Karen's smirk faltered for just a second. It's about maintaining the neighborhood's aesthetic. Tom crossed his arms. That's not an answer. The room got quiet. Some homeowners nodded in agreement. Karen sighed. Look, the rule is there for a reason. We need consistency. Either you remove the garden, or you'll start receiving fines. Tom clenched his fists. You mean the same fines that other houses with flower beds aren't getting? A few murmurs spread through the room. Karen's face tightened. I'm not here to debate this, she said coldly. The decision is final. Tom gritted his teeth. Then I guess I have no choice. Karen smirked again. Glad you understand. Tom leaned forward, looking her directly in the eye. Oh, I understand perfectly, he said. And I'll see you in court. Karen's smirk disappeared. Linda squeezed Tom's hand. The battle had begun. The room was dead silent after Tom's words. Even Karen, who always had a snarky comeback, looked caught off guard. She blinked, then forced a smile, as if she wasn't rattled. Well, Tom, you're welcome to do what you think is best. But I should warn you, fighting the HOA can be expensive. Tom didn't flinch. I guess we'll see. Without another word, he turned and walked out, Linda following close behind. The second they stepped into the hallway, Linda let out a breath. Are we really taking this to court? Tom nodded. I don't see another option. They're targeting us for no reason. And I'm not letting them destroy your garden. Linda gave him a grateful smile, but there was still worry in her eyes. Tom pulled out his phone and started making a list. Step 1. Gather proof. They needed to prove that the HOA was selectively enforcing their so-called rules. Over the next few days, Tom walked the entire neighborhood, taking pictures of houses that had flower beds, decorative rocks, even artificial turf. Not a single one had been found. He talked to neighbors, too. Some were supportive, saying they loved the garden and thought the HOA was being ridiculous. Others? They were too scared to speak up. One elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Dawson, pulled Tom aside in a hushed voice. You be careful, son, Mr. Dawson warned. Karen doesn't like being challenged. People who go against her, well, things tend to get difficult for them. Tom frowned. What do you mean? Mrs. Dawson sighed. Our neighbor put up a small wooden fence a few years ago. Karen didn't like it, said it was out of style. When they refused to take it down, suddenly they started getting fines for other things, trash cans left out too long, weeds that didn't even exist. They ended up moving. Tom's stomach twisted. So Karen wasn't just power hungry, she was vindictive. Well, that just made Tom even more determined. A few days later, he got another letter from the HOA. This one wasn't just a fine. It was a full-blown legal threat. Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in further penalties, including potential legal action and liens on your property. A lien? That meant if Tom and Linda didn't pay the fines, the HOA could try to claim ownership over part of their property. Tom's blood boiled. This wasn't about a garden anymore. This was about control. They wanted to scare him into backing down. But Tom wasn't backing down. He gathered all his evidence, the photos, the witness statements, the HOA's own vague bylaws. Then he did what Karen never expected. He hired a lawyer. A tough one. A guy named Mike Reynolds, who specialized in taking down corrupt HOAs. The first thing Mike did was laugh when he saw the violation notice. Oh, this is weak, he said. They're bluffing. Hard. Tom frowned. So they can't actually force us to remove the garden? Mike shook his head. Not legally. Their rule about grass being the dominant feature is too vague. It's unenforceable in court. And on top of that, you have proof they're only enforcing it against you. That's called selective enforcement, and it's illegal. Tom felt a surge of hope. So what's the next step? Mike smirked. We hit them where it hurts. The next day, a formal legal complaint was delivered to the HOA. It accused them of selective enforcement, harassment, and improper fines. Karen? She lost her mind. She sent out another letter. This one doubled down on threats. The HOA will not tolerate defiance. If the garden is not removed immediately, we will escalate enforcement. Tom read the letter out loud and laughed. She's panicking. Linda, though, wasn't laughing. She was watching the street. Tom followed her gaze and saw a white SUV parked across from their house. A person sat inside, watching their home. Tom's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about fines anymore. Karen was playing dirty. Tom stared at the white SUV parked across the street. It had been there for almost an hour, and the person inside hadn't moved. Linda's voice was tight. Do you think that's them? Tom exhaled sharply. Wouldn't surprise me. Karen's the type to send someone to monitor us. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the car. If they were going to play dirty, he was going to keep records of everything. But that wasn't the only thing the HOA had in store. Over the next few days, the harassment ramped up. First, they received 3 new violation notices in the mail, things they had never been fined for before. Trash cans were out too early, but their security cameras showed otherwise. Their mailbox was not HOA approved. Even though it was the same model as half the neighborhoods, the paint on their house was fading, which was ridiculous because Tom had repainted it last summer. Linda was shaken. This is exactly what the Dawsons warned us about. Tom gritted his teeth. Karen thinks she can bully us into giving up. She has no idea who she's dealing with. He took all the new violation letters and sent them straight to Mike, their lawyer. Mike read through them and chuckled. They're digging their own grave. Then, things got even worse. One morning, Linda gasped from the front porch. Tom, come here. Tom rushed outside. His stomach dropped. Linda's rose garden, her pride and joy, had been vandalized. Several bushes were cut at the base, their beautiful flowers ripped away. Linda covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. Who would do this? Tom clenched his fists. We both know who. They checked their security cameras, and sure enough, at 2:37 a.m., a figure in dark clothing sneaked onto their lawn with garden shears. The video quality wasn't perfect, but Tom recognized the way they moved. Karen's lapdog, a board member named Jeff. Tom sent the footage to Mike immediately. Mike grinned. Oh, this is good. Real good. They've gone from unfair fines to destruction of property. That's a whole new level of legal trouble. But Tom wasn't just going to sit back. He made copies of the footage and sent them to every single neighbor. The message was simple. This is what happens when you stand up to the HOA. You could be next. People started talking. The neighborhood's group chat exploded with outrage. Neighbors who had stayed silent before were now furious. This is disgusting. Who gave them the right? This is criminal. Can't they be arrested for this? We need to do something about Karen and her goons. The tide was turning. And Karen? She was about to find out that she had messed with the wrong homeowners. Karen had ruled the HOA with an iron fist for years. But now, her power was slipping. Tom's security footage of Jeff vandalizing the garden had spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once been too scared to speak up were angry, and they weren't hiding it anymore. The next HOA meeting was packed. Normally, only a handful of homeowners showed up, but this time, over 50 people crammed into the community center. Karen sat at the head of the table, her lips pressed into a tight line, flanked by her usual yes men. Tom and Linda sat in the front row, arms crossed, faces set, ready for war. Karen cleared her throat. Let's begin. First order of business. Tom stood up. Actually, I have a question before we start. Karen's eyes narrowed. This is an open discussion, Tom. Tom held up a printed photo, a still image from the security footage, showing Jeff cutting Linda's roses in the dead of night. The room gasped. Karen froze. I think it's only fair, Tom continued, that before we talk about business, we discuss why one of your board members was caught trespassing and destroying private property. Karen forced a smile. I don't know what you're talking about. Tom raised an eyebrow. Really? Because everyone here has seen the footage. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Someone shouted, Yeah, explain that, Karen. Karen's face turned bright red. This meeting is for official HOA matters, not baseless accusations. Tom smirked. Oh, it's not baseless. In fact, I have a lawyer who disagrees with you. That's when Mike stood up. Every head in the room turned toward him. Mike adjusted his tie. Mike Reynolds, legal representative for the Johnsons. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. And I'd like to officially inform the board that we will be filing a lawsuit for harassment, destruction of property, and selective enforcement of HOA rules. The room erupted. Neighbors whispered, some cheering. Karen's fake smile vanished. You can't be serious. Mike shrugged. Oh, I'm very serious. And since this case involves one of your board members committing criminal trespassing, I imagine the local news might be interested, too. Karen's jaw clenched. Now she was trapped. If this went public, the HOA's reputation would be ruined. And worse, she'd have no control over what happened next. For the first time in years, Karen wasn't calling the shots. Someone else was. And that someone was Tom. Karen was losing control, and she knew it. For years, she had bullied homeowners into silence. But now, the entire neighborhood was turning against her. And the lawsuit? That was the final straw. The second Mike mentioned going public, Karen's fake confidence cracked. She leaned forward, gripping the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, grabbing her papers. But the homeowners weren't having it. People shouted over her. "You can't just run away, Karen. What about the vandalism? We're sick of this abuse." One man, Mr. Dawson, stood up. He had been quiet for years, too scared to challenge Karen. But tonight, he wasn't afraid anymore. "I move for a vote," he said. "Effective immediately, I propose we remove Karen as HOA president." The room went silent. Karen's eyes widened. "You can't do that." Mike, still standing calmly in the back, smirked. "Actually, they can. Per your own bylaws, the homeowners can vote to remove any board member with a majority." Tom grinned. He had read those same bylaws. And now, they were about to use them against her. Another neighbor, Sarah, raised her hand. "I second the motion." Karen's face turned red. "This is ridiculous. I have done nothing but uphold the rules." Tom crossed his arms. "You mean the same rules you selectively enforce? The ones that apparently don't apply to your own yard?" Karen froze, because he had proof. Tom pulled out printed photos, pictures of Karen's own front yard. Her grass was patchy and overgrown. She had unauthorized decorations on her porch, her mailbox, not HOA approved. People in the crowd whispered and pointed. The hypocrisy was blinding. Tom turned to the room. "How many of you have been unfairly fined by Karen's HOA?" Slowly, hands went up, one after another. Soon, over half the room had their hands raised. Karen looked around, realizing this was it. She was outnumbered. Mr. Dawson cleared his throat. "All in favor of removing Karen as HOA president?" A sea of hands shot up. Tom raised his hand. Linda raised hers. Even some of Karen's former allies turned on her. Karen's face drained of color. "You can't do this." Tom smirked. "We just did." Sarah stood up. "Then I move that we elect a new HOA president immediately." Karen shot to her feet. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." But no one was listening. Because at that moment, Karen was no longer in charge. She had lost everything. And Tom? He had won. Karen was done for. She sat there, stunned, as the reality of her defeat sank in. The homeowners had spoken. She was officially removed as HOA president. For the first time in years, she wasn't in control, and she hated it. But Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. As homeowners cheered, she stood up suddenly, knocking over her chair. Her face was twisted with fury. "You think this is over?" she snarled. "You think you've won?" Tom folded his arms. "Pretty sure we have." Karen glared at him. "This neighborhood will fall apart without me. You'll all see." Someone in the back shouted, "Don't let the door hit you on the way out." The room burst into laughter. Karen grabbed her bag, storming out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt free. The aftermath. The very next day, Tom and Linda got a letter. Not a fine, not a threat, but an official statement from the HOA. The previous fines against them? Voided. Their garden? Completely allowed. And Karen? She was gone. Not just as HOA president, but from the neighborhood entirely. Rumors spread that she had put her house up for sale overnight. Some said she was too ashamed to face everyone. Others believed she couldn't handle living in a place where she had no power. Either way, she was out. And the new HOA leadership? They were nothing like Karen. The first thing they did? They revised the ridiculous rules Karen had enforced for years. No more pointless fines. No more harassment. No more Karen. The neighborhood changed for the better. And Linda? She expanded her rose garden, planting even more flowers. Every time she stepped outside, she saw the symbol of their victory, a garden that had once been under attack, now flourishing. Tom smiled as he looked at it one morning. This whole fight, he said, started over a few flowers. Linda took his hand, and it ended with a neighborhood finally standing up for itself. Tom nodded. No more HOA tyranny. No more power-hungry Karen. Just peace and a beautiful garden, standing as a reminder that sometimes the little fights, they lead to the biggest victories.
Hope you enjoyed this story. If you'd like to hear more, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next one.